We take terrorism seriously. We condemn terrorism in all its forms, and we are actively engaged in combating it.
Wow, that's the president of Finland addressing Turkey's concerns about Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Turkish leadership accusing them of harboring terrorists and blocking an early vote on their membership. Now, their application would expand Europe's security landscape in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But really upsetting Russia, author of the new book, The Power of Crisis, How Three Threats and Our Response Will Change the World. The president of the Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer, is back. Ian, welcome.
Good to see you, man.
The significance of Turkey standing in the way of Finland and Sweden, what is it about?
Turkey has 70% inflation right now. Their economy is in free fall. Erdogan is much less popular than at any point in his presidency as a consequence of that. And this is an opportunity for them to queer the pitch of this massively important expansion of NATO, and they want to be paid off. That's all it's about. It's a negotiating feint. They see themselves as having good leverage. They will ultimately allow this to go through.
Ironic that Finland and Sweden get into NATO and Ukraine's doing all the fighting and they're not.
Well, first, a couple reasons for that, right? One is that Ukraine has been occupied physically by Russian forces since 2014. Now, if you enter NATO, the collective security clause means that the NATO allies have to defend you. Have to defend you. So, number one, that was never a possibility. And number two, I mean, as much as we love the Ukrainians, and everyone now does because of the courageousness they're showing on the battlefield, their institutions are weak. There's been a lot of corruption. I mean, they were not set up to be Finland or Sweden before February 24th. And even with the European Union, you have the German chancellor saying, yes, we'd like the Ukraine in the European Union, but we're not going to put them ahead of the queue of some of these countries in the Western Balkans that have been setting up.
Although we're in awe of what they've achieved so far.
We are in awe of what they've achieved in the battlefield. Absolutely, yes.
The book is, I love your book because I like learning stuff, getting new depth on international relations, what like only you can do when I'm interviewing you, but you put it down in the printed word and the power of crisis. And one thing you bring up is China and what they bring to the table and what they don't. And you said, hey, U.S., look out for this Belt and Road program. You want to be the most influential country in the world. So does China. Belt and Road program says to countries, I'll build your infrastructure, I'll give you a loan, and if you don't pay me back, we'll handle it when it happens. So far, some of these developing countries aren't liking the deal they got from China, but they do have the influence of China.
You know, sometimes it takes a crisis. I write about this in my book. You remember in the Cold War, it was the Sputnik moment that got the Americans to invest in the space race, eventually got us to the moon. Right, in the year of my birth, 1969. The fact is that the Chinese are the ones that have been investing massively through Belt and Road, digital Belt and Road, renewable energy in a way, and the Americans have been forgetting about it. And suddenly we look around the world and we say, wow, China's the biggest trade partner of all these countries everywhere. We have to do something. We have to be engaged. Otherwise, it's going to be China's game. They invest massively in solar and nuclear and wind and electric vehicles. If we don't do that ourselves, where's the United States going to be?
What's it going to take to have our wake-up moment? What's going to wake us up to this Sputnik challenge?
I think the fact that China is very soon going to be the largest economy in the world, the fact that so many countries that are politically oriented towards the U.S., just in the Western Hemisphere, all the South American economies that like the United States, friends like Colombia and Brazil, Chile, who's their largest trading partner? China. That's absolutely a wake-up call, and clearly it's one of the very few issues that you can get Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate to agree on those sorts of investments.
And real leadership would explain it to the American people because we love the competition and the challenge. Ian Bremmer, you did it in The Power of Crisis. You want to explain quickly for Memorial Day? You want to be ready to go? Go grab this book right now.
Yesterday, reporters asked me if I thought President Putin was smart. I said, of course he's smart, to which I was greeted with, oh, that's such a terrible thing to say. I'd like to tell the truth, yes, he's smart. The NATO nations, and indeed the world, as he looks over what's happening strategically with no repercussions or threats whatsoever, they're not so smart. They're looking the opposite of smart. If you take over Ukraine, we're going to sanction you, they say. Sanction? Well, that's a pretty weak statement. Putin is saying, oh, they're going to sanction me. They sanctioned me for the last 25 years. You mean I can take over a whole country and they're going to sanction me? You mean they're not going to blow us to pieces, at least psychologically? The problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb. Dumb. So dumb. And they so far allowed him to get away with this travesty and assault on humanity. That's what it is. This is an assault on humanity. So sad.
The next forum will take place in 2019. We will know by then how effective the Belt and Road Initiative will be, but at least we've already made some progress. Facts show that we are implementing some of our plans. All the deals we signed during the forum were agreed upon by the participating countries. We will not make decisions that harm ourselves.
This is genius. Putin declares a big portion of the Ukraine. Putin declares it as independent. Oh, that's wonderful. So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that? And he's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. That's the strongest peace force. We could use that on our southern border. That's the strongest peace force I've ever seen. There were more army tanks than I've ever seen. They're going to keep peace all right.
We salute China's large-scale initiative of One Belt, One Road and putting this initiative forward. President Xi has demonstrated an example of an innovative approach to developing integration in energy, infrastructure, transport, industry, as well as the humanitarian field, which we have heard in detail right now.
С партнерами по интеграции продолжим формировать общие рынки, укреплять внешние связи Евразийского экономического союза. В том числе предстоит воплотить в жизнь уже принятые решения о сопряжении Евразес с китайской инициативой «Один пояс, один путь», как пролога к созданию большого евразийского партнерства. Наши равноправные, взаимовыгодные отношения с Китаем сегодня служат важным стабилизирующим фактом в мировых делах, в обеспечении безопасности в Евразии. Показывают пример плодотворного сотрудничества в экономике.
Во-первых, я считаю, что это мероприятие является пока уникальным. Это инициатива председателя КНР, нашего большого и моего личного друга, председателя Си Цзиньпиня. Оно прошло удачно. Это удачное, крупное, удачное мероприятие. Рассчитываю, что оно положило начало новому этапу сотрудничества в Евразии. И не только в Евразии. В мире экономики у нас очень много совпадающих целей и взаимодополняющих возможностей. Поэтому у меня нет никакого сомнения, что мы будем работать вместе, и эта работа будет эффективной, принесет пользу как китайскому, так и российскому народу, но и не только нам, будет влиять на глобальную конъюнктуру в мире. Я хочу поблагодарить еще раз китайскую сторону за организацию этой работы.
This is all possible by one thing and one thing only. United States destroys countries and takes it over and gives country money. China gives countries money and also rebuilds the infrastructures of those countries. So if you're a country, who would you rather go with? One who steals, kills, and destroys, or one who gives you money and builds?
The Comac C919, China's first major passenger airliner, ready to take off for commercial flights later this spring. In a market dominated by American and European planes, it's a sign of China's ambition to step to the front of the global stage. China's emergence as a major trading nation is now well established, but the next step is to build up better trade relations with China's neighbors under a policy known as One Belt, One Road. Along the trade routes of the ancient Silk Road and old maritime links, China's aim is to forge a new trading hub in the developing world. And in return for opening markets, China's offering to help its neighbors build up much-needed infrastructure.
The lack of the infrastructure building, they need money, they need to state-owned enterprises. Private companies in the West, they're not interested to invest in the infrastructure. But without infrastructure, economic takeoff, very difficult.
Under the Trump administration in the US, the impetus for that appears greater. An inward-looking White House seems to be withdrawing from international commitments on trade and aid.
After President Trump, of course, it's more urgent that China should take more leading role, not just learning and follow-up of the Western countries. That's China maybe not ready, but we are learning how to do.
China's leaders have been working hard to sell that message overseas. Thailand is an integral part of the One Belt, One Road scheme as one of Southeast Asia's major economies. It's also a vital part of a new high-speed rail network designed to link southwestern China to Singapore. But agreement on construction has stalled after Thailand complained the terms of loans for the rail network were not favorable. And some complain that China's using its size to dominate its neighbors.
Be a regional leader, China has to be much more measured, much more magnanimous, benevolent, and it's not showing that. So we have to wait and see if China would be willing to change.
This is the World Trade Center in Beijing, completed in 1990 when China was far from being the economic powerhouse that it is now. Today, of course, it is dwarfed by the enormous tower blocks that have sprung up all around it as China has developed. But with great power comes responsibility. And if the One Belt, One Road initiative is to be a success, then it'll be up to China to convince all of those countries taking part that there is benefit for all. Tony Cheng, CGTN, Beijing.
The Belt and Road Initiative is currently China's most ambitious international project. With promises of financial profits for rich countries and development for the poor, it has attracted considerable interest.
I think that's the most important project for investments in the world for the next 100 years about. That's the sense of this, and there's a vision, and I think the world needs some visions.
If China and France together are working with the different experiences, I think we can promote new projects with a lot of new opportunities in many countries, for example, in Africa.
Even United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres is interested in China's initiative as he struggles to bring UN development goals up to speed.
The 5 pillars of the Belt and Road, policy coordination, facilities connectivity, unimpeded trade, financial integration and people-to-people exchanges are intrinsically linked to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These are conceptual pillars that can be translated into real-life progress for every people.
But not everyone is convinced. Suspicions abound that China does not care about development, but about increasing its global influence. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo portrayed China as an unreliable business partner during a visit in London on Wednesday.
China peddles corrupt infrastructure deals in exchange for political influence. Its bribe-fueled debt trap diplomacy undermines good governments and threatens to upend the free market economic model. on which so many countries depend, and which has lifted up hundreds of millions of people out of poverty.
China's foreign ministry lashed out angrily on Thursday.
They're not tired of saying this, but we are tired of hearing this.
A foreign ministry spokesman praised the success of last month's Belt and Road Forum in Beijing.
A total of 6,000 delegates from 150 countries and 92 international organizations attended the second Belt and Road Forum for international cooperation, including more than 50 representatives from the US.
The United States and China are currently engaged in tough trade negotiations, with the Trump administration threatening new tariffs on Chinese imports if a deal is not reached. Zlatica Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
Including more than 50 representatives from the US.
On May 15th, leaders from 30 countries and key international organizations wrapped up the Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation in Beijing. The goal? Recreating the Silk Road.
The wide-ranging engagement of China is more necessary than ever today. Our world is multipolar, but that by itself is no guarantee of prosperity and peace. A multipolar world needs multilateral cooperation and multilateral governance to face common threats and to seize shared opportunities.
The project itself has long been a focal point for China. Chinese President Xi Jinping says the new Silk Road is designed to connect Asia and Europe and to strengthen the economic ties between regional leaders. Only by coordinating the policies of different countries, integrating economies, and developing resources on a global scale will we be able to concentrate our efforts to support world peace and common development. The Ukrainian delegation also participated in the forum. First Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, Stepan Kubiv, emphasized the advantages of Ukraine as a logistical hub. Ukraine cannot stand apart from the One Belt, One Road global project. It is territorially and geopolitically an indispensable part of the grand project. The roads from east to west and from north to south cross in Ukraine. Ukraine was and is a reliable partner for those who respect its sovereignty, history, culture, and people. Kubiv also invited Chinese investors to participate in the privatization of Ukrainian state enterprises and to take advantage of Ukraine's potential in the IT and aerospace industries. The new Silk Road would be incomplete without Ukraine's participation. Beijing will spend $124 billion on the global economic project. Almost all countries in Europe and Asia are ready to join. This is Vivica Williams with UATV.
The world is in the grip of unprecedented economic crisis. World leaders are engaged in heated debates at the World Economic Forum annual meeting, which opened on Wednesday in Davos, Switzerland. Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin is calling for a new global economic system that is fair and efficient. Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao is calling for a review of the balance between saving and consumption and the regulation of new financial instruments. These are some of the 2,500 participants at Davos 2009. They include many heads of state and Nobel laureates, as well as CEOs. At the center of this global business network is Klaus Schwab, the forum's executive chairman. Each year, Schwab brings together the world's movers and shakers to address today's global challenges.
Because this is a transformational crisis. It's not just a cyclical crisis. It's a transformational crisis, which means we have to change our patterns, our behavior, maybe our rules, in order to make sure that we avoid a similar crisis in the future.
Today, we'll hear his insights on reshaping the world post-crisis.
Welcome to today's Close-Up. I'm Hiroko Kuniya. According to the latest IMF forecast, growth in the world economy in 2009 will drop to a post-war low of 0.5%. How do the 40 heads of state and business leaders at Davos this year view the fast-spreading crisis? And what measures will they devise to overcome it? Shaping the post-crisis world is the theme at Davos this year. The annual conference has become a key forum for bringing together leaders in various fields to discuss the important issues of the day. The forum was started by Klaus Schwab in 1971, who was then just 33 years old. For nearly 40 years, he has gathered the world's leaders together annually to address global challenges in shaping the future while seeking to build mutual trust. He says today's crisis in our globalized world is a transformational one that will bring about fundamental change. He warns that the crisis will deepen if the world fails to build institutions that can help resolve the mid to long-term challenges along with the present economic crisis. He says this is no longer the time for each country or company to pursue self-interest. I spoke with him in this exclusive NHK interview.
Klaus Schwab is 70 years old. He makes the final decision on whom to invite and what to discuss at Davos. While paying close attention to continuous change in the world, he has helped to generate new ideas for overcoming global challenges. A native of Germany, Schwab studied economics in Switzerland and taught at the University of Geneva for nearly 30 years. He started the Davos Forum in 1971, when a major shift began in the workings of the global economy. He brought together European business leaders to learn American-style management. Since the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, the Davos Forum has taken up global political issues, as well as economic ones. In 1990, South African anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela was released after nearly 30 years in prison. Schwab invited Mandela and then South African President F.W. de Klerk to the Davos Forum in 1992 to demonstrate international support for abolishing apartheid. In 2001, Schwab invited the Israeli and Palestinian leaders to Davos to encourage a dialogue between them. The Davos Forum has played a significant role in efforts to tackle these and other international problems. This year, the Forum sees the U.S.-born global financial crisis as the most pressing issue. Schwab says what we need to overcome this crisis is a global effort to create a new system with a new way of thinking.
Professor Schwab, thank you very much for joining us today. The world has experienced a rapid economic decline after the financial crisis. People are losing their jobs and the companies are going out of business. Insecurity looms all over the world. What would you say is the significance of this year's global meeting in Davos?
It is probably the first crisis of a global age, and Davos brings together all the decision makers, not only from business, from governments, civil society, academia, in order to look what were the reasons for this crisis, and much more important, how can we come out of this crisis, and how will the world look after the crisis? What we need now is to bring the best minds together and to see how can we change? Because this is a transformational crisis. It's not just a cyclical crisis. It's a transformational crisis, which means we have to change our patterns, our behavior, maybe our rules, in order to make sure that we avoid a similar crisis in the future.
But for the past few years, it has been known that at the global meeting, people were talking about the possible systemic risks that is present in the financial crisis. Why do you think, despite of all the warnings, it was not listened to?
We all were in this euphoria, thinking now the world will continue to grow on a global level at 5% every year. We overlooked the serious danger signals. And what we have to do now is to make sure that we establish the necessary rules, institutions. Maybe we also have to change our own morality in order to make sure that in the future this is not happening again. We need more intergenerational responsibility. We have to look much more at the long-term wealth generation processes. If we want to create sustainable progress, we have to introduce into business a more long-term perspective.
So is that a suggestion that many of the participants that were present in the last few years at the World Economic Forum were major executives at from Wall Street, from the city? Were you saying that maybe they were too much driven with bonuses and short-term objectives?
It's not only the managers. Don't forget, there were also the shareholders. We all were part of the game. I compared it with the situation. You had a big highway. And the highway is called globalization. So what happened is that suddenly some people started to race at 150, 180, 200 miles, and the whole traffic got faster and faster. So it was a kind of what some people call exuberance in our system. And suddenly some cars who went too fast crashed. Lehman Brothers and so on. So they crashed. Now we have a big crash. Everybody ran into the crash. And now our situation today is that governments acted as ambulances. They came to rescue the injured people, all the banks and so on. That's where we stand today. Now what do we have to do? We have to look for each injured person or each bank or each organization. What is his state of health? How can we make sure that he survives? But that's not enough. We have also to introduce new regulations along the highway to make sure that this is not happening anymore.
And now, as you say, there is more or less consensus on the need for more regulation. But do you think there should be a shift in the economic thinking of how economic development should take place as well?
What we need in any case is to accompany global economic development with more global cooperation. Because we do not want to come back to the highway example. We do not want to install so many signs and rules in the highways that nobody wants to drive anymore. So we need stronger global cooperation. And we are living in a global economy, but of course our national systems still prevail when we edit laws, when we look at policies. So what we have to do is to coordinate much better on a global level.
Schwab says finding a global solution to the crisis requires international networking that goes beyond purely national interests. The World Economic Forum employs a staff from 55 countries who are in constant touch with global leaders. Schwab thinks it's important that global political and business leaders work together to tackle the global challenges. Apart from the annual Davos meetings, the World Economic Forum has hosted international meetings at other venues. One of them, in 2007, in the Chinese city of Dalian, brought together 1,700 leaders. They discussed a wide range of issues, including China's economy, global climate change, and poverty. And last November, the forum hosted an economic summit in the Indian capital of New Delhi. Executives of leading Indian companies and business leaders from 35 other nations took part. The aim of these meetings is to help build global networks. Schwab says constant cross-border communication will help generate new ideas that lead to solutions to global problems.
I think networking is an important aspect. You invariably can't get a forum or a summit where all of the business leaders come together.
I mean, you have been trying to create a network which is very diverse and multilateral. Is that a scheme that the forum is trying to create for a new possible governance of international issues?
The World Economic Forum is, if I may say so, it's a connecting organization. It's a connecting organization. Say are governmental organizations or say private organizations. We need an approach where we integrate all actors, because the big challenges in the world cannot be solved by governments alone or by business alone. We need to connect the key governmental and non-governmental actors. But also, when you look at the problems in the world of today, they are all interconnected. You have health, which is related to development. You have environment, which is related to trade. All those issues today are interrelated. But our international system is based on a very departmentalized approach. So we have a World Health Organization for health issues, we have a World Trade Organization for trade issues, we have an IMF for financial issues, because such a connecting organization is absolutely necessary in the 21st century.
I was wondering whether you wanted to depoliticize the issues so that they can be solved more easily, or
yes, but
is that what is necessary?
When there is a crisis which affects practically all countries in the world, every country wants to protect itself best, and even if it's at the detriment of other countries. I think in a crisis, in a negative, in a bad situation, everybody becomes more egoistic. And we have absolutely to make sure that this is not happening. The problem is that national governments are under the pressure of the national public opinion in order to be re-elected. So the national electorate, they want to see governments acting, doing something, and the temptation to do something which preserves national interests but is contradictory to global interests, a catalyst to stimulate long-term discussion, because don't forget, Governments usually have a perspective of 4 years. Business leaders have a very short-term perspective. We want to integrate into the decision-making process a more long-term perspective and a more integrated perspective.
Schwab says a new philosophy is needed for the post-crisis era. Last year, he wrote a piece in the U.S. magazine Foreign Affairs. He coined the phrase global corporate citizenship, urging businesses to be good members of the global community. Schwab was referring to the global space in which governments have less authority. He stressed the need for companies to play a role in tackling issues that could have a dramatic impact on our future. These include global warming, dwindling water resources, and deepening poverty. Schwab argued that the idea of global corporate citizenship could help resolve some of the problems we face. He cited the efforts of this major Swiss food company to save water resources. The company reduced water use at its plants to show that large users like themselves had a duty to manage water resources. The company also funds projects to dig wells to supply drinking water. Schwab says the important thing is that businesses work with governments and NGOs to create a system for resolving global problems. The idea of global corporate citizenship goes one step beyond the concept of corporate social responsibility. Schwab says if more companies put this idea into practice, it could generate a new model for resolving global-scale challenges.
You have coined the word corporate global citizenship.
Yeah.
That is a new world. How is that different with corporate social responsibility?
It goes beyond. Corporate social responsibility means that you take care of your stakeholders, your immediate stakeholders, which means your neighbors, you take care of your employees, and so on. Corporate citizenship, global citizenship, means that your stakeholders are not only those with whom you interact in your daily life. Those stakeholders are today in the global world. It's also the farmer somewhere in Africa who has problems because he has not enough water, he has not enough seeds, and so on. So how to take care of those more distant stakeholders? That is, let's say, the purpose of corporate global citizenship.
Why do corporations have to be thinking about the distant global problems?
Because if let's take Africa, there are two reasons. The first one is a reason of social justice. We cannot have a world which is divided into people who suffer and nobody cares for them, and on the other hand, people who live in relatively good conditions. But the other reason is, if we look at the economic development over the last 10 years, until we had the crisis, this development was mainly driven by the new consumers which we had in China, in India, and many other countries. So this farmer in Africa somewhere could be a consumer if we give him the opportunity to make a good living, to earn his money, he becomes also a consumer.
So you were saying that the corporation are also a stakeholder in the sustainable development of the globe.
And citizenship means that you have a license to operate globally, but you have also certain duties. A citizen always has rights and duties. And one of the duties is to take care of certain issues where governments alone are not sufficient enough to provide solutions, where the combination of the expertise of companies and the engagement of civil society and the financial means of governments provides an ideal platform to address an issue in a practical way.
Do you find that this crisis is not an easy time for the corporations?
But let's face, if we neglect the other challenges which we have, let's take climate change, then we may solve the present crisis, but the next crisis is just in front of us, and we stumble from one crisis to another crisis. I think the big challenge which we have in the world is that we have to address so many challenges at the same time. And all those challenges are very complex, and the time which we have at our disposal is very short. And the consequences of a climate change crisis may be much more dramatic even compared to what we see in the financial world today. The dream is that the world is really interconnected, that the world looks in a long-term way at the challenges which we have, that everybody feels this sense of global responsibility. Globalization is not an ideology, it's a fact. We are interdependent. Pollution doesn't stop at the border. So my dream is that the world looks at all those issues in a way where we feel much more interconnected and where we feel really part of a global community committed to improving the state of the world.
Mr. Schwab has watched the world change for nearly 40 years. He said the world has become increasingly politicized, and countries tend to negotiate and seek compromise only in their own interests. He cited the need for a neutral system that acts in the global interest to resolve cross-border challenges. Mr. Schwab said such a system is not established top-down, but through bottom-up efforts in which everyone takes part. He said the Davos meeting is a place to debate how we can create such a system.
Well, the Chinese president also met with Klaus Schwab, the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, on the sidelines of this year's annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. Schwab earlier said Xi's presence was a sign of the shift from a unipolar world dominated by the United States to a more multipolar system in which rising powers like China will have a step up and play a bigger role. Before Xi delivered his keynote speech, Schwab said, "In a world marked by great uncertainty and volatility, the world is looking to China."
China has its Belt and Road Initiative, and we think that there's a much more equitable way to provide for the needs of countries around the world. We represent values that our democracies represent, and not autocratic lack of values. We've just wrapped up what has been an extraordinary collaborative and productive meeting of the G7. Everyone at the table understood and understands both the seriousness and the challenges that we are up against and the responsibility of our proud democracies to step up and deliver for the rest of the world. That's what the G7 is all about, and rallying the world's democracies to meet the challenges that the world faces and deliver for our people and for people, quite frankly, everywhere. Ending the pandemic and maintaining robust support for an equitable, inclusive global economic recovery were the top priorities of our nations as we got together. We know we can't achieve one without the other. That is, we have to deal with the pandemic and in order to be able to deal with economic recovery, which, as we're doing in the States, but we committed that we're going to do more for the rest of the world as well. I committed that we would provide $500 million beyond the 80 million we've already done, 500 million doses of Pfizer vaccine, which we contracted to pay for, in addition to money we put into the COVID. That generated was a commitment by the rest of our colleagues at the G7 that they would provide another 500 million. So we're going to have 1 billion doses of vaccine. And in our case, that includes sharing more than not just the 1 billion doses overall, but we're going to provide for 200 million of those doses by the end of the year, another 300 million by the first half of next year. And so it was greeted with some enthusiasm. And we've agreed to work together so that the world is better prepared to detect and deal with future pandemics, because there will be future pandemics. We also made a momentous commitment at the G7 to help meet more than $40 trillion need that exists for infrastructure in the developing world. I put forward an idea that was called, we named the Build Back Better World Partnership, which is, we're calling it the B3W. The point is that what's happening is that China has its Belt and Road Initiative, and we think that there's a much more equitable way to provide for the needs of countries around the world. And so it's a values-driven, high-standard, transparent financing mechanism we're going to provide and support projects in 4 key areas: climate, health, digital technology, and gender equity. And we believe that will not only be good for the countries, but be good for the entire world and represent values that our democracies represent, and not autocratic lack of values. By harassing the full potential of those who are harassing, we're going to have to change things. That's the whole idea.
Today we officially launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. We collectively have dozens of projects already underway around the globe. And I'm proud to announce the United States will mobilize $200 billion in public and private capital over the next 5 years for that partnership. We're here today because we're making this commitment together as a G7 in coordination with one another to maximize the impact of our work. Collectively, we aim to mobilize nearly $600 billion from the G7 by 2027. These strategic investments are areas of critical to sustainable development and to our shared global stability. Health and health security, digital connectivity, gender equality and equity, climate and energy security. I want to be clear, this isn't aid or charity. It's an investment that will deliver returns for everyone, including the American people and the people of all our nations. It'll boost all of our economies. It's a chance for us to share our positive vision for the future. We'll let communities around the world see themselves and see for themselves the concrete benefits of partnering with democracies.
Geopolitical battle lines are being drawn. President Joe Biden has launched 2 new initiatives to rival China's international commercial ambitions. One is a global infrastructure program that looks to build physical and digital infrastructure connecting dozens of countries spanning Asia, Africa, and Europe. The other is a trade bloc in Asia Pacific that encourages Western businesses to relocate elsewhere in the region away from China. It took Washington more than 10 years to develop these 2 programs. Up until now, there was no credible alternative to Chinese investments. And though the details have yet to be negotiated, the 2 initiatives make up the hallmarks of Biden's foreign policy. So, what is this about? And can America beat China at its own game? Writing the new rules of the 21st century economy is not easy. At the G7 summit in June 2022, Biden and his counterparts launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or Pgii. At heart, the Pgii is a reinvention of Biden's previously proposed Build Back Better World initiative, which sought to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. Drafted in 2021, Build Back Better World gained little traction despite vigorous lobbying. The primary problem was gathering support for the initiative at home. Consequently, the lack of public commitment made it difficult for Washington to finance the project independently. Not surprisingly, Build Back Better World failed to pass in Congress. Now, roughly a year later, Biden has reached a new deal to spread the burden of financing by teaming up with the other G7 countries. The new plan is for the G7 nations to mobilize $600 billion over the next 5 years to invest in global infrastructure projects. Most of these projects will take hold in middle and low-income countries, and most projects will be geared towards 4 categories: renewable energy, healthcare, gender equity, and digital infrastructure. Biden says that the plan will allow participating nations to see the concrete benefits of partnering with democracies. Either way, the United States has pledged to contribute $200 billion to the initiative, while Germany, France, and Italy will raise 300 billion euros, and the remaining of the total grant will come from the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan. How much funding will come from the private and public sectors is unknown. Though impressive, America's Partnership for Global Infrastructure initiative still falls short in funding compared to its rival, the Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing's infrastructure project doesn't have an official price tag, but China has invested about 800 billion euros across the globe, which surpasses the investments promised by the G7. And China isn't done yet. Trillions more dollars are expected to be invested through the 6 arms of the Belt and Road Initiative in the coming decade. What's more, according to official Chinese data, Beijing has signed more than 170 cooperation agreements with 125 countries and another 29 agreements with international organizations across Asia, Europe, Africa, and South America. Matching the size and scope of China's grand strategy will be tricky. even for the G7 nations. But perhaps the biggest issue with the Pgii, the elephant in the room if you will, is that the United States is bad at infrastructure investing. In fact, America is bad at maintaining its own physical infrastructure, let alone working on infrastructure projects abroad. It is by no means an accident. In 2020, Chinese firms won $2.3 billion worth of contracts outside China, while the United States gathered only $27 million worth of contracts. $2.3 billion versus $27 million is a staggering difference. America has a lot of strengths, but China is just better at building. Nevertheless, Biden's project could give China a run for its money. The Pgii could provide some recipient nations with a feasible alternative to China. If implemented, the G7 infrastructure plan would reduce Beijing's influence in some places. For instance, in Angola, $2 billion will be invested in a solar-powered project, while $600 million will be invested to build a submarine telecommunications cable connecting Singapore to France through Egypt and the Horn of Africa. Still more, a multi-million-dollar vaccine manufacturing facility will be built in Senegal. These projects, and many others like it, would be constructed by either American or European companies. Doing so makes the Partnership for Global Infrastructure initiative less of a charity act and more of an investment to deliver returns for everyone. Yet, as promising as it sounds, in some places where the arms of the Belt and Road Initiative pass, Central Asia for instance, the geography and economy depend on either Russia or China. Biden's plan will make little to no difference in such places. The second part of Biden's endgame is the trade aspect. 1 month before signing the Pgii in May 2022, Biden had rolled out a new type of economic agreement that included 13 nations in Asia Pacific: Japan, India, Australia, South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, New Zealand, Fiji, and Brunei. The deal, dubbed the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, or IPEF for short, is Biden's pivot to Asia to contain Chinese commerce at sea. The IPEF comes 5 years after Trump abandoned Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Trade deals are notoriously disliked in the United States, which is why Obama's proposal failed to deliver. Biden, however, is going in another direction, something more flexible and loose. Unlike its previous iteration, the IPEF does not guarantee free trade between its members. Instead, it is an understanding to deepen cooperation between the United States and the Asia-Pacific nations. The details have yet to be negotiated, but taken together with the United States, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity represents about 60% of the world's population and nearly 40% of the global GDP. Those are some serious numbers. The purpose of the economic alliance is to counter China's influence by enhancing political and economic cooperation within the region. The IPEF will focus on 4 pillars: supply chains, renewable energy, anti-corruption, and maritime trade. The members of the economic bloc will enjoy certain advantages from American companies that are looking to relocate away from China. So, as Western businesses move away from China in the coming decade, the IPEF has the potential to fill the vacuum. India, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines have large workforces that could step up and fill the void. The shortcoming, however, is that without greater access to the US market, the IPEF will lack the game-changing incentive to tip the balance. The terms are still being negotiated and the talks could last until 2023, but the fundamental question is whether or not Washington will offer lower tariffs or access to the US market. But since trade deals are difficult to close in the United States, the full reach of the IPEF is yet to be determined. Biden and his Asia-Pacific counterparts know this and see the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity as a stopgap policy that holds on to the belief that American domestic politics will come around and pivot to Asia. A sincere pivot this time. By any means, the greatest misconception in geopolitics is seeing the global order as a stable, immutable structure. America is still number one in criteria such as military, economy, and diplomacy. But the new kids on the block are increasingly challenging that role. China's Belt and Road Initiative has had a 10-year head start. And while the Pgii and the IPEF are presented as America's triumphant countermove, it ultimately boils down to execution. A bad plan that is well executed will yield better results than a good plan that is poorly executed.
You may be more interested in, again, what the Chinese did while we were traveling, and we have said from the start that our representation here is not about changing the status quo here in Asia, changing the status quo of Taiwan. It's about, again, the Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S.-China policy, all of the pieces of legislation and agreements that have established what our relationship is, to have peace in the Taiwan Straits and to have the status quo prevail. They may try to keep Taiwan from visiting or participating in other places, but they will not isolate Taiwan by preventing us to travel there. We've had high-level visits, senators in the spring, a bipartisan way, continuing visits, and we will not allow them to isolate Taiwan.
On July 5th, the White House posted this seemingly uncontroversial and unremarkable tweet, a list of places it had donated vaccines. It seemed like a banal government press release few would give much thought to. That is, until it was suddenly deleted, and for fear of causing an international incident, no less. See if you can find why. The problem was not the actual donation, nor was it the mere reference to Taiwan, a word the US government uses all the time, and nowhere in the tweet were the words country or nation. No, the concern was about this tiny flag, which the White House called an honest mistake. So fragile is this issue that merely tweeting an icon of a flag might be interpreted as a change in policy, or even a recognition of statehood, something that could trigger a military response by China. And yet, so too could deleting the tweet cause confusion. Afterward, the Taiwanese Foreign Ministry asked the US not to cause unnecessary speculation after its president and de facto ambassador were left retweeting a message now deleted. This was not the first such diplomatic mishap, nor surely will it be the last. The US government practices a strategy of deliberate ambiguity, leading much of the public, many in the media, and even a few politicians to misunderstand its position. Despite what China would have you believe, the US does not, in fact, adhere to the One China principle. Neither does it support Taiwanese independence, though it does have unofficial relations with its government. The reality is much more complicated. When Mao Zedong founded the People's Republic of China in 1949 and promised to, quote, liberate Taiwan, the US initially decided not to intervene. Only after the invasion of South Korea in the summer of 1950 did the Truman administration begin recognizing the strategic value of Taiwan. 4 years later, in 1954, the US signed a defense treaty promising to protect Taiwan if attacked. This, along with America's refusal to recognize the PRC, lasted for another 25 years, until it discovered a bigger threat, the Soviet Union. Largely in response to the communists up north, America finally recognized the People's Republic in 1979 as the, quote, sole legal government of China. It promised not to pursue a two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan solution, which meant ending official relations with Taiwan. It also stated, in a communique, the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. Upon hearing this, you, like many people, might conclude that the US acquiesced to the People's Republic. But if so, you're not paying close enough attention. It recognizes the PRC as the sole legal government of China, but doesn't define what China is. Remember, Taiwan is formally known as the Republic of China, and both claimed to be China. On the other hand, it merely acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. The key word here being acknowledge, which is not the same as accept or recognize. It does, however, give a similar impression, at least on a cursory reading. And this is certainly no accident. The American position then and now is to obfuscate, to narrowly satisfy China's stringent demands while giving up as little as possible in the process. The US could argue it fulfilled its obligations, while China could argue the US fully agreed to its position. A mutually enforced facade of resolution. In reality, nothing said or done back in '79 truly resolved the issue. Both sides only kicked the can further down the road. And far worse than simply delaying that ugly conversation, the talks created the superficial illusion of agreement, leading to hurt feelings and accusations later on. In other words, America spoke as vaguely as possible, which China gladly exploited. The Chinese translation of the document, for example, uses a word closer in meaning to recognize, despite there being an accurate translation of acknowledge available. It's quite possible that many in China and even Taiwan, most of whom read the document in Chinese, believe the US promised more than it actually did. That was, after all, kind of the point. There's another similar linguistic misconception. The One China principle is the term for China's position, that Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic. This is not the same as generic lowercase One China policies, which every country has a different version of. When China accuses another country of violating the One China principle, it's really only saying that it disagrees with the action, not that the other country has broken a promise. Make no mistake, the US does not adhere to the principle, only to its own policy, one which has gone unchanged for over 40 years. Now, in the process of recognizing the People's Republic, the US ended its defense treaty with Taiwan, replacing it instead with the Taiwan Relations Act. The TRA was designed to reassure Taiwan by providing it with the weapons it needs to defend itself. And while it states an expectation that the issue will be resolved peacefully, it does not guarantee military support, only that the president will inform Congress of any potential threat, and then take appropriate action. Still, all parties operated under the assumption of eventual unification. All that changed in the 90s, as Taiwan transitioned from brutal authoritarian rule to what is today one of the strongest and most vibrant democracies on Earth. The process was neither smooth nor easy, and made advocating for independence legal, complicating the situation. Today, the future status of Taiwan is still the primary issue that divides parties. On one side are the Blues, who favor closer economic ties to China. China buys nearly half of Taiwan's exports, which they see as a critical relationship to maintain. To them, China is less an adversary and more a business partner. The dominant party in this camp is the Kuomintang, or KMT. On the other side are the Greens, led by the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP. Greens see trade with China as a dangerous dependency that leads to economic coercion. They prefer the term Taiwan to the Republic of China. But while the KMT is sometimes sloppily labeled pro-unification and the DPP pro-independence, this is simply not true. In reality, both sides agree that maintaining the status quo is the best short to medium-term strategy, and neither side, except for a few radicals, advocates unification or independence. The Greens argue Taiwan is already an independent sovereign state, and thus has no reason to declare independence, something which would surely start a war. None of this is meant to discount the ferocity of Taiwanese politics. Healthy democracy is fierce and messy, but to highlight how subtle their differences. This graph helps put things in perspective. When asked their preferences, the Taiwanese public has answered remarkably consistently for 20 years. The top 3 responses are all maintain the status quo, and only differ in the long term. 28% prefer to decide at a later date, 27% wish to maintain the status quo indefinitely, and 1/4 wish to maintain the status quo but move toward independence. Only a small minority wish to unify immediately, move toward unification, or declare independence as soon as possible. Ironically, it's most often Americans halfway across the globe who panic when China flies fighter jets through Taiwanese airspace, not the Taiwanese public, for whom such shows of intimidation have become mundane. Most are content simply keeping things as they are. As is the United States. Officially, it does not support independence. But remember, American diplomats are precise in their meaning. The US does not say it opposes independence, which would mean taking a position. But while it does not take a stance on the outcome, it does advocate for the process. Not only does it oppose a forceful unification by China, so too does it oppose a unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan, something that would also destabilize the region. When Taiwan's president proposed a public referendum on independence in 2003, the US was caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, it did not support what it perceived as dangerous antagonizing. On the other, it did not want to publicly oppose a legal democratic process. Instead, it reiterated, indirectly but unequivocally, that it did not support independence, sending the message that the president had crossed a line. Since then, Taiwanese officials have gone out of their way to prove they don't plan on rocking the boat. In 2018, current President Tsai Ing-wen stayed silent on a referendum calling for its Olympic name to be changed from Chinese Taipei to Taiwan. And she's in the green camp. Every major politician today understands the need to proceed with caution, repeating, sometimes monotonously, that they won't pursue independence. That doesn't stop China from claiming they support independence, however, which engenders nationalism at home and helps narrow the boundaries of what's acceptable. But things can't continue like this forever. While America and Taiwan support the status quo for now, everyone agrees it's untenable in the long term. One of the 3 red lines China says the crossing of which would trigger an attack is if Taiwan refuses to ever consider negotiating unification. The possibility of change, however minuscule, is thus imperative to maintaining the peaceful status quo. The question is, in what direction does time favor? In terms of public opinion, the answer is clear. When broken down by age, it's evident that younger generations feel an increasingly strong Taiwanese identity distinct from China. The 2014 Sunflower Movement demonstrated how determined young people are, which recent developments in Hong Kong will surely only convince them of more so. And yet, every day China's military and economy grow stronger. It may believe time is on its side, that the balance of power will only shift in its favor. Likewise, does it surely notice America's growing disinterest in acting as the world's police force. China may doubt the will of Americans to fight a war so distant at a time when it's so preoccupied at home. In the meantime, Taiwan is stuck in a historically unprecedented limbo. A weird in-between state in which it can enjoy freedom only if it pretends not to. A status quo that has somehow survived 8 American administrations, 40 years, and yet can suddenly be called into question with a mere icon of a flag in a tweet.
Probably using our visit as an excuse. Let me close by saying this. The Chinese have tried to isolate Taiwan keeping them most recently from the World Health Organization by not even letting their participation be on the agenda of the World Health Agency, whatever that makes these determinations. They may try to keep Taiwan from visiting or participating in other places, but they will not isolate Taiwan by preventing us to travel there. We've had high-level visits, senators in the spring, a bipartisan way, continuing visits, and we will not allow them to isolate Taiwan. They are not doing our travel schedule. The Chinese government is not doing that. Our friendship with Taiwan is a strong one. It is bipartisan in the House and the Senate, overwhelming support for peace and the status quo in Taiwan.
China says it's sanctioning U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her family after she visited Taiwan. Beijing considers the self-governing island part of its territory and called her trip a provocation. The military exercises have prompted some ships to navigate around the Taiwan Strait, disrupting key trading routes for cargo and commodities sailing around the world. It's proof of the economic fallout any escalation in the region would have globally. Trade between China and Taiwan has also seen interruptions. Let's take a look at some of the fallout from Nancy Pelosi's visit. In a warning shot, China has banned imports of over 2,000 different products from Taiwan, mainly food products, both processed and fresh. Beijing has stopped exporting sand to the island, a product necessary for Taiwan's construction industry. China's also created a blockade of types of Taiwan as it patrols the sea surrounding it, which could prevent all imports and exports, paralyzing Taiwan's economy and crippling the trade in semiconductors needed in everything from smartphones to healthcare equipment and defense systems. That's one reason this story has traders gripped around the globe.
Now, when we look at COVID, I think we should distinguish between three phases. We have the three R's. Restrain, which means to fight the virus, the hot phase. Most countries are in today. Then we have recover, to go back to a kind of new normal. And finally, the reset, which means to define and to design the strategies which should lead us in the after-corona phase. What is the objective? What kind of world do we want to build? What do we know? What did we learn? I think the world which we want to create with the Great Reset has to be much more resilient. It has to be because security, people will demand more security, physical security, health security. It will have to be more inclusive. We had already a big gap before the crisis started. This gap will be tremendously increased. So if we want to avoid some kind of social revolutions, and we have seen the signs of anger on the streets already the last weeks, so we have to address this issue to create a stronger inclusiveness. And finally, more sustainable, because we know now that the next crisis is already waiting for us around the corner, and it is the climate crisis. let's also be clear. The future is not just happening. The future is built by us, by a powerful community as you here in this room. We have the means to improve the state of the world. But two conditions are necessary. The first one is that we act all as stakeholders of larger communities, that we serve not our only self-interests, but we serve the community. That's what we call stakeholder responsibility. And second, that we collaborate. And this is the reason why you find many opportunities here during the meeting to engage into very action and impact-oriented initiatives to make progress related to specific issues on the global agenda.
I know it's hard for some people to believe on what's really going on. The Great World War that's been happening. Russia, Ukraine are in the Belt and Road Initiative. So you have to ask yourself, who is actually in conflict over there in Ukraine and Russia? If you look at everything, you could see who the culprit is, and it's the United States. So the war in Ukraine is actually the United States creating havoc in the region, pinning it on Russia going against Ukraine, when in fact Russia and Ukraine is in the Belt and Road Initiative. Zelensky in the new Ukraine is with the United States. See, there's two governments operating across this world in many different countries. This is why it's so confusing. This is why there's double crossing.
See a war happening in Europe. Mr. President, you emphasized the importance of foreign investment in your country. You have foreign investors here, or very powerful investors. What would be the three key arguments? You mentioned some in your speech, but if you had to summarize, what are the three specific strengths that Ukraine is offering to a foreign business investor?
Well, thank you for your question, and I believe that we have more than three strengths and examples. There are things that we are ready to discuss with really powerful Western investors. Not just warm words, please come and we will defend your investment. We prepared the program which is called Investment Nanny. For each investor, big company who will bring $100 million US, plus we will conclude a separate contract with the state. It will be the state who will defend you. It will be the manager, nanny, speaking 5 languages and available 24/7. With you, any question, any problem, you will be in direct touch with the manager and there will be no problem whatsoever. Secondly, for all investors who are ready to join the large-scale privatization, I have not mentioned it yet, and we're preparing large-scale privatization in the beginning of spring. For today, it will be 500 enterprises ready to be privatized. Please come for the first 2 years. All investors who will participate in privatization, $10 million US dollars plus, we will ensure the tax break, tax holidays. You will not pay the corporate income tax for 5 years. Please welcome. As I said, well, land reform, concessions, deregulation. We really have a slew of bills in the pipeline that I'm ready to discuss with you for hours. It's profitable, really, and advantageous to invest money in Ukraine. We have talented, and I don't want to call Ukrainians cheap, but talented, cheap experts. Please.
I call this the ultimate slip-up. He just said his entire people of Ukraine were cheap and even had a smirk on his face. If this doesn't explain to you what is actually going on, I don't know what else will. He just sold Ukraine to the highest bidder and said Ukrainians are cheap. Peace and love, everybody.
And I don't want to call Ukrainians cheap, but talented, cheap experts. Please.
Mr. President, please, thank you for your first visit in Davos, and we hope we can welcome you back in the coming years. And every year we hope to hear from you a success story. And certainly we will support you in all your reform efforts, and we wish you all the best for the democratic and I would say very fast development of the potential which you really have with your human resources, but also with your central, as you mentioned, with your location as a key country in the Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much.
Last Saturday, I declare public international health emergency outbreak of butt pumpy pox. You may say to yourself, why all of a sudden are there 500 different outbreaks of different diseases when usually in our made-up history this happens about every 100 years? That is because we need to print infinite amounts of money to prevent economy from collapsing. And while we're at it, it provides a pretty good excuse to control the sheep. I know I am lying, and you know I'm lying. But let's face it, everyone is no longer scared of terrorism, and we are running out of ideas. So if you could just play along, it would be appreciated. I myself will be limiting my homosexual partners to just Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, and Xi Jinping. They are my sugar daddies and pay my rent, so I need to do my part and take care of daddy. So do not spread disinformation and only share videos from authoritative sources.